The convergence of a potential future American presidential candidate, Donald Trump, engaging with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, simultaneous to a U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, undertaking direct discussions with Russian President Vladimir Putin, marks a profoundly complex and potentially pivotal moment in the ongoing conflict. This confluence of high-stakes, multi-layered diplomacy, operating on both official and quasi-official tracks, underscores the escalating pressures and the desperate search for an off-ramp in the Russia-Ukraine war, even as the stated one issue suggests an intractable core problem. The meeting between Trump and Zelensky is fraught with layers of political calculus and strategic gambits. For Trump, the interaction serves multiple purposes. Domestically, it reinforces his image as a global player and a potential peacemaker, aligning with his long-held claims of being able to end the war swiftly. It allows him to demonstrate a proactive foreign policy stance ahead of the U.S. presidential election, potentially contrasting himself with the current administration's approach. Internationally, it signals to allies and adversaries alike that he is already engaging on critical geopolitical issues, even as a private citizen. His past skepticism towards extensive U.S. foreign aid and his America First rhetoric, however, introduce an element of apprehension for Ukraine. Zelensky's decision to meet Trump is equally pragmatic. Faced with the very real possibility of a second Trump presidency, Ukraine cannot afford to alienate a figure who could significantly alter the trajectory of U.S. support. This meeting is an attempt by Kyiv to understand Trump's true intentions, to present its case directly, and perhaps to mitigate any potential future policy shifts that could prove detrimental to its war effort. It is a necessary risk, a hedging strategy against an uncertain American future. Concurrently, the mission of U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff to Moscow for talks with Putin introduces an entirely different dynamic. Witkoff's role, whether as a formal or informal emissary, signifies a direct line of communication, likely sanctioned at some level by the current U.S. administration, to probe Russia's ultimate demands and potential conditions for de-escalation. The statement that ending the war comes down to one issue is critically revealing. While the specifics remain undisclosed, this one issue almost certainly refers to territorial integrity and sovereignty. From Russia's perspective, this means the recognition of its annexed territories, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, as Russian. For Ukraine, it means the full restoration of its internationally recognized borders. This fundamental divergence forms the insurmountable chasm that has thus far precluded any meaningful peace negotiations. Witkoff's mission, therefore, is likely an attempt to gauge the rigidity of Putin's position on this core territorial question, and whether any creative solutions, perhaps involving a temporary freeze or a demilitarized zone without formal territorial concession, could be explored. It is a reality check, an assessment of Moscow's red lines and potential flexibility. The background to these simultaneous diplomatic maneuvers is critical. Trump's history with Ukraine includes the 2019 impeachment proceedings, centered on allegations of withholding military aid to pressure Zelensky into investigating political rivals. His consistent rhetoric has questioned the scale of U.S. support to Ukraine, suggesting Europe should bear more of the burden and claiming he could end the conflict within 24 hours. This past shapes current perceptions and adds a layer of apprehension to his engagement. The broader history involves Russia's long-standing geopolitical grievances, its perception of NATO expansion as an existential threat, and its imperial ambitions rooted in historical claims over Ukrainian territory. The current administration's policy, largely aligned with robust support for Ukraine's sovereignty, stands in stark contrast to Trump's stated desire for a quick resolution, which many fear would come at Ukraine's expense. The historical precedent for backchannel or informal diplomacy exists, often employed to test waters without the full weight of official commitment, but rarely has it occurred with such a high-profile, potentially disruptive, private citizen operating in parallel to an official envoy. The current context of the war itself amplifies the urgency of these diplomatic efforts. The conflict has settled into a grinding war of attrition, with significant casualties on both sides and little dramatic movement on the front lines. Western aid, while substantial, faces increasing domestic political headwinds in the U.S., particularly from elements within the Republican Party. European resolve, though generally strong, also faces internal economic and political pressures. Ukraine is in a precarious position, needing continued Western support to resist further Russian advances, but also acutely aware that its long-term viability depends on a lasting, just peace. Russia, despite heavy losses, has demonstrated a capacity to sustain its war effort, adapting to sanctions and receiving support from other revisionist powers. The upcoming U.S. presidential election is a sword of Damocles hanging over Kyiv, threatening a potential radical shift in Washington's foreign policy that could leave Ukraine isolated. This geopolitical chessboard involves not only Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow, but also NATO, the European Union, and increasingly, countries like China and those in the global south, all with their own stakes in the conflict's outcome. The one issue truly is the crux. If it is indeed territorial integrity, then the prospects for an immediate breakthrough are exceedingly dim. Ukraine, having endured immense sacrifice, cannot politically or morally cede territory, as it would legitimize Russian aggression and establish a dangerous precedent for future land grabs. For Putin, retracting his annexation claims would be an admission of defeat, a humiliation he cannot afford given his domestic political standing and his justification for the war. Therefore, any solution around this one issue would require either an unprecedented reversal by one side, or an incredibly creative and complex diplomatic framework that manages to defer or obfuscate the core territorial dispute while establishing some form of security guarantee. Witkoff's mission, then, is likely not to broker a final peace deal, but to establish parameters, identify non-starters, and perhaps explore whether a temporary cessation of hostilities could be achieved, even if the underlying territorial issue remains unresolved. In conclusion, the simultaneous engagements of Donald Trump with Volodymyr Zelensky and Steve Witkoff with Vladimir Putin represent a high-stakes, multifaceted diplomatic gambit aimed at navigating the treacherous terrain of the Russia-Ukraine war. It highlights the profound uncertainties surrounding future U.S. policy, the deep-seated nature of the conflict's core issues, and the desperate search for any viable pathway towards de-escalation. The interplay between official and quasi-official diplomacy, with a potential future U.S. president operating in parallel to an existing envoy, adds an unprecedented layer of complexity. While Trump's meeting with Zelensky is largely a political maneuver and a strategic hedging for Ukraine, Witkoff's mission to Moscow is a direct probing of Russia's maximalist demands, almost certainly revolving around territorial concessions. The enduring challenge remains the fundamental incompatibility of core demands, where one side's one issue of sovereignty directly clashes with the other's one issue of territorial annexation, making any immediate, comprehensive peace elusive, even amidst intensifying diplomatic pressure. The world watches, recognizing that the outcome of these discussions, however informal or exploratory, could shape the future of European security and the global order.